Hi everybody. So in this video we're going to look at the third handout in our ecology chapter, and in this handout we'll look at adaptation of organisms to ecosystems and then spend some time looking at how the feeding of one organism by another feeds into the whole way in which a habitat or an ecosystem works. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about adaptation, what do we mean? Okay, so it's important for organisms and a big part of how they can survive and thrive in an ecosystem. And it's defined as when an organism develops characteristics that make it better suited to its habitat. Okay, and adaptation, particularly physical adaptation, is the result of evolution. Okay, so as I said, there's two types of adaptation: physical adaptation and behavioral adaptation. So physical adaptation is where the organism has physically changed in some way. So we have the example of cheetahs. They've evolved to be the fastest animals on the planet so they can chase down their prey, which is the second fastest animal on the planet. You've got things like a snail, which has evolved to have this hardened shell to try and protect it from predators. Okay. Plants also have adaptations. Nettles produce a sting so that other so animals won't eat them. Flowers is a huge adaptation. So the reason why flowers look the way they do, why they have these bright white or colored petals, and the reason why they give off a smell or a scent is specifically to attract bees and other pollinators, insects, or sometimes larger pollinators like hummingbirds and bats. And this is because the pollinators, when they go into the flower, carry pollen, which is then transferred to another flower for reproduction, which I've mentioned in a previous handout. Okay. Now we also have behavioral adaptations, which are harder to spot. Okay. So examples of behavioral adaptations that can be seen in certain types of rodents, such as field mice, which are nocturnal, so they go out at nighttime to make it harder for predators to spot them. Bears hibernate in winter when food is scarce. Wolves hunt in packs, so they can coordinate between each other and kill their prey more easily. Okay, so these are examples of behavioral adaptations. It's the physical adaptations, however, that drive evolution. When an animal gains a physical adaptation, which they get through random mutation. Okay, so one animal is slightly bigger or taller or stronger or faster or smaller than the other animals by random mutation. And that organism, that animal is then better able to survive in its habitat. It lives for longer and reproduces more, and those offspring have that same trait. They're that bit bigger or stronger or faster or smaller, okay? And then that gets passed on and on and on over the generations until that minor change is amplified into a major change that produces an entirely new species. Okay, now, next we want to talk about niche. Okay, so all organisms within an ecosystem will normally play a specific role. The scientific term for this role is a niche. No two organisms would occupy the same niche in an ecosystem, but you could have similar roles that are overlapping niches, okay? Various roles all come together in a single tapestry to make our ecosystem work. If an outside influence were to start killing organisms, then the niche they filled is no longer occurring, and this will often disrupt an ecosystem, sometimes to a devastating effect. So this is where we talk about the importance of things like pollution, obviously, but also biodiversity. Okay, if biodiversity starts to drop, and biodiversity is the word we use to describe the numbers of different organisms that you have in an ecosystem. If biodiversity starts to drop, then that can have a massive impact on the entire ecosystem. Okay, so now we're going to talk about feeding relationships within an organism. So we've already talked about the different types of organisms based on how they get their food. The producers, which make their own food from photosynthesis, i.e. plants, photosynthesizing algae and the likes. Then you got the consumers who are either eating the producers, i.e. the plants, herbivores, sheep, cows and the likes, or they are eating animals that eat the plants. All right? So, for example, a rabbit would eat grass and a fox eats the rabbit. Okay, foxes also eat berries, so they're what we call an omnivore. Okay, and then you get your decomposers, and they get the nutrients by breaking down dead organisms. So then the fox dies, and the bacteria and the fungi land spores on the fox, and they feed off it and break it down, and the nutrients from that go back into the soil. So there are three types of food source. Sorry. So these three types of food source, typo there, create a flow of energy throughout your ecosystem. Okay. All right. So sorry, I'm just spotting some typos in this note. The energy originally comes from the sun. That's where the energy in all ecosystems, with the exception of a few on the bottom of the oceans, which we'll learn about next year. We can talk about it, and we're back in class. But with the exception of those few, all energy originally comes from the sun, which is absorbed by plants. Okay, the producers. They then use their energy to make food and to grow. And then when they get eaten, that energy that they have in them that they got from the food they made from the energy they got from the sun passed into the organism that ate them, and then into the organism that eats that organism, and then eventually back into the soil through the decomposers. Okay, so we have two ways in which, in ecology, by which we can describe this flow of energy in our ecosystem. And the first is a food chain, and then a food web. Okay, and this is a big part of how of our study of ecology is tracking how energy flows through the ecosystem in the form of food. So a food chain is a simple linear description of the flow of energy from one organism to another in a single path. At the start of our chain are the producers. After the producers are what we call our primary consumers. So these are consumers that live exclusively off the producers, i.e. herbivores. Next comes secondary consumers. So these are organisms, animals that feed off of the animals that were feeding off the plants. So my example of my grass would be our producer, our rabbit would be a primary consumer, the fox would be a secondary consumer. Okay? And then comes tertiary consumers and so on and so forth. Okay? So these are organisms that feed off the secondary consumers, and then last you got your decomposers, and they feed off the dead remains of all of the above, the producers, the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So you got a simple example here of probably a grassland or maybe a woodland ecosystem. Okay, so you got a rose, which is a producer. That's a plant. It photosynthesizes. Then you got the aphids or green fly, which live on roses. They feed off of the plant. They would be our primary consumer. So when I say primary consumer, you don't have to be always thinking of things like cows and sheep. Any organism, including insects that live off a plant. Then you've got ladybirds, which are a secondary consumer. They don't eat plants, they eat greenfly or orchids. And then you got sparrows, which come along and eat the ladybirds. Okay? So they're a tertiary consumer, tertiary meaning three. Now, all of them, the rose, the greenfly, the ladybirds, the sparrows, if they're not eaten, they'll naturally die, and then they're broken down by our decomposers, our mushrooms and our fungi. And then they're broken down and returned back into the soil. Okay? So the energy system started with the rose absorbing energy from the sun, making food through photosynthesis. Some of that food was taken by the greenfly, so it had energy. The ladybird eats the greenfly, so it has energy, and the sparrow eats the ladybird. At each stage in this chain, there is a loss of energy. So greenfly have to eat lots of plants, ladybirds have to eat even more greenfly, and sparrows have to eat even more ladybirds. Okay? So, and then eventually they all die and it goes back into the ground. Now, so not every food chain, by the way, would have all of these stages. So you could have a food chain with only has 2 or 3 links. For example, if we consider the food chain with grass as our producer and the European bison, which you can still find in nature reserves in places like Poland, they would be a primary consumer. But they're the only other organism on this food chain would be a decomposer, because there is nothing in the habitat of a European bison that's big enough and tough enough to hunt and kill a bison. Okay, you might think, sir, what about bears? Bears don't hunt bison, folks. Seriously, they don't. Okay, a bear would never consider hunting a bison, because while it might kill the bison, it could also get killed because it's a bison. So not every food chain has 3 or 4 links. It might have only 1, 2, 3. It'll always have a primary producer. It will usually have a primary consumer, and it will always have a decomposer, and it may have secondary or tertiary. Okay, so food chains are useful because they help us look at a very specific section of an ecosystem and how the various organisms in the ecosystem, I do not know what is going on here, interact with each other. However, a food chain will not give us an overall idea of the bigger picture of the ecosystem. So for that, we need a food web. So how food webs work is they're similar to food chains, but what they do is they look at all the different organisms that you might find in a habitat. Okay, so they're much more useful when looking at wide-scale ecological studies and looking at biodiversity. A food chain doesn't look at biodiversity as much. Okay, They can also help us identify the impact that disease, pollution, or other activities such as invasive species may have on an ecosystem, because they see how it will affect a wider web if something is being affected within that. All right. So it's literally like if you have a web and you start plucking threads out of it, the entire web might be okay because there's other strong anchoring threads, or it might all collapse. Okay. And that can be part of our ecosystems. Okay. So here's a very simple example of a food web. There's another in your books on page 101. Okay. So this food web here is from a grassland or meadowland habitat. Okay. That's what it's demonstrating. Okay. So the way works is at the bottom, we've got our producers. We've got our carrots, our grass, and our grain. These are our primary producers, okay? And then we've got all the different animals that will eat them. So a rabbit will eat grass and carrots. Mice will eat grains. Grasshoppers will eat grass and grains, okay? Now you got birds, which will eat your grasshoppers, including the owl. So when I say birds, I mean things like sparrows and thrushes will eat them. So owls will also eat grasshoppers. Owls will also eat the mice. Okay? The fox eats the rabbits, but he'll also eat small birds. Okay? And nothing eats the owl. All right? So the owl and the fox are what we'd call apex predators. They eat other organisms, but they don't eat any themselves. So in this example, our primary producers are the carrot, the grass, and the grain. Our primary consumers would be the rabbit, the mouse, or the grasshopper. And our secondary consumer would be birds like sparrows and thrushes, or also the owl. And the fox could be considered either a secondary or a tertiary consumer. If you're just following up from the carrot to the rabbit to the fox, it's a secondary. But if you go grass, grasshopper, small birds, and fox, it's tertiary. But you get the idea. And through these food webs, we can see how they're all interconnected with each other. Okay? So we also get to see in a food web our apex predators, which isn't always obvious through a food chain. So that's basically it, folks. Now we got some questions here at the end. What is the definitions of adaptation? What are two types of adaptation found in organisms? Give an example of each of the two types of adaptation you listed, okay? So for question 3, I want an example of both types of adaptation you listed in question 1, not just an example for one of the two, okay? What is a scientific term for a specific role played by an organism in its ecosystem? So all of these are up above, fairly straightforward. If you read through the handout properly and carefully, you could answer these pretty easily, okay? You don't even need to have necessarily have listened to this video, okay? So we're going to fix this spelling mistake. And we'll say occurs. Right, so I'm going to stop correcting this stuff now. There you go. I hope this helps. Sorry about the class earlier for those of you who were on. My Chromebook was just crashing. I don't know what was going on with it, but it should be back up next week. Keep an eye out for announcements regarding assignments for next week relating to end of year reports. All right, so thanks everybody. Try to keep focused. Thanks for all the great work you've been doing for me so far. Some really excellent stuff being produced by people in the class. Keep positive, help out at home where you can, and remember to wash your hands.